Right, so a little while ago we took a look at a really cheap Nvidia graphics card that you could buy for around 30 quid, and it did so well that we sold out the entire stock in the UK within around half an hour. But what if I told you there's an AMD equivalent, it's slightly more expensive, costing around 40 quid, but this here is more modern, with more features, and apparently even more power. So why don't we take a little look at what we've got. And this here is what I bought, the Radeon Pro WX5100, which I've seen go on eBay for around 30 to 40 quid for a little while now, near an RX 580 or RX 480. But, as you probably noticed, it's a little single slot card offering all that power at that price, no 6-pin. Meaning you could use this in any system, which I think is the appeal of this, is that you get real graphics card performance, but in a package that one, looked quite cool, and two, doesn't need any extra power. So you could whack this in an Optiplex, but why don't we plug this in and just find out if it works, because I do think it's going to need some tweaking to get the power out of it. In a similar vein to the Nvidia card we looked at, you only get DisplayPort, but you get 4 slots, so you can use that for HDMI, DVI, VGA, whatever you really want. And installation should just be that. And for most people, this is probably the more sensible choice than the Nvidia option because, well, they shouldn't need much in the way of setting up. Yeah, these are going to take me a little while to install because being professional drivers, I think we'll be able to get gaming drivers on here with one little workaround, but we'll see how it works out of the box first. We get the lovely blue Pro Edition installer, which is not something I'm used to seeing. Just see what kind of performance you get with one of these out of the box. Like if you just bought one of these, plonked it in your computer, used the drivers you should, didn't do any tweaking at all, how's it actually going to perform? So we'll let these install, go through, probably load up and do a quick synthetic benchmark and then maybe a little bit of gaming. And then I want to see if there's any way to tweak this, like we did with the Nvidia equivalent, to make this better. So this model actually came out of a Dell. It's based on Ellesmere, which I think is a form of Polaris, 14 nanometers, 1792 shaders, 8 gigs of GDDR5, which isn't too bad, but it's looking like it is clocked really rather low down. But it has the specs on paper to actually be a really competent gaming card. But we'll do a restart and actually see how it's performing out of the box. So the Radeon Pro drivers are just, I mean, they look just like the normal AMD drivers. I mean, applications is called Create, which makes sense, it's designed for creative tasks. We get all the normal graphics options you'd expect from AMD's gaming drivers. So it doesn't come with much tuning, you get fan controls. Oh, the tiny little fan is working its hardest at 5,500 RPM, and it's still really quiet. But yeah, you can't do much in the way of actual tweaking in this, which is fair enough. I am sort of hoping that it just works well, so I'm guessing there is quite a bit of power limiting going on to fit it into this form factor because, yeah, not exactly anywhere close to the RX 480 or RX 580 series, but it is really solid in terms of frame rates. I'd imagine there's definitely some form of VSync or something going on in the drivers, because look at this frame time graph. It is just a smooth line. Score of in and around 1700, which is maybe not as good as I was hoping. See what it does in a game? By default, Cyberpunk's on a mixture of low and medium, so I am just going to run it through the benchmark. It is in 1080p. I just want to run the benchmark to see if we can get a figure to work from, just so it's a reliable figure. Yeah, it's hovering around 30 FPS during the more intensive part, and it's going up to still around the mid-30s in this part here. So yeah, I mean, Cyberpunk works out of the box. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to confuse a lot of people, but we're going to install this graphics card. I'm going to run DDU, and after I've done this, I'm going to explain what we're doing to hopefully improve the performance. Now, I've not tested this, I've not read about it, but I figured the best way of doing this is going to be figuring out myself, like I did last time. And what these should do is install it with game-ready drivers. Without us having to faff about modifying BIOSes, it should just be as simple as using these drivers rather than using the other ones. I'm not calling myself a genius because plenty of other people have probably thought to do that, but by running these drivers, as you can see here, it is now installing it as the Radeon RX 580X, which is an actual gaming card. Things are looking a little bit better, but then again, these drivers don't do particularly well in benchmarks. Something tells me that we are probably going to have to go a little bit deeper with this card than I originally planned. But still, it's good to have a little bit of data and find out how it does stock, modded drivers, and then I do think we are going to have to modify the BIOS. So the modified drivers allowed us to gain 12 points. We'll see what that actually changes to in the world of gaming. We have actually gained a couple of frames per second in this opening segment, which I wasn't really expecting. Comparing that to our result before, and we have gained 0.2 of a frame per second. So much like how we dealt with our last Nvidia card, there is a few things we need. So namely, we need the BIOS of the card, which we can get from GPU-Z here. Save that to a file, and then using the Polaris BIOS editor. Now the main things I've gone ahead and done is I fixed the power controls so it should be able to use the full 75 watts available to it on the PCI Express lane. I've fixed a few other little bits and pieces. Memory should now boost up to where it should be. That isn't set correctly there at all. They're largely limited by a locked down BIOS, but still, we've got the timings tighter from where they should be. We've got the memory boosting up to 1850. Power targets are set. All I have to do now is flash this, and this should now perform quite a bit better. So I'm going to save this file as WX5100. So this should now be flashing the latest modified BIOS to the graphics card. As you can see here, the current VBIOS is the same as the new VBIOS. We've just changed how it actually should apply. So all we should need to do before we reboot is we want to run this specific patcher file just so that it doesn't give us a code 43 on restart. We have got a display, which is a good sign. But yeah, even 3D Mark isn't reporting clock speed. Oh, we've got the code 43 error. Right, so second time's the charm. It was purely because you need to be running the WX drivers. The nabbed drivers do trigger the code 43. But yeah, there we go. GPU clocks are actually where they should be now. Memory clocks are up to 1850, which is nice. And it has pretty much doubled performance. And that took maybe 5 minutes tops to actually go ahead and apply that BIOS mod. This thing probably is going to be seriously decent, but you're leaving half the performance of this card on the table if you leave it stock. I mean, of course, we will double check that that actually does translate to real world game performance, and if the thermals don't get too bad, because I have set power targets on it, and thermal targets as well. That's looking really decent, essentially doubling the performance with much smoother frame times, and this is with a very moderate load of settings. This isn't pushing it by any means. The core is pretty much exactly where it was, the memory's where it should be, and the power limits are still, I mean, we'll be able to check afterwards, but it's still going to be running under 70 watts. Now that's where this thing becomes good. We have literally doubled the graphics score. So to give you an idea, the average is 2,169. The best score ever recorded is 3,618. And we've scored within 250 points of the best sample out there. This is the problem I had with the M4000, is they're really fun to tweak around with. Let's see what we can push this to. I'm gonna get back to being stupid. Is probably the best way of describing it. I'd imagine to eke out that extra around, what are we talking, 240 points now, you're probably going to need to set up some better cooling, but as it stands, 3,040 points from just a PCIe lane, that's pretty solid going. Well, suddenly there's your contender. You whack that in any computer, and we may even try that later on in the video, just take a normal computer with a crap power supply, whack that in there and see if it becomes a gaming PC, because I think it'll be able to do it. Oh yeah, that's really good. 48 frames per second in around 40 to 50 frames per second right now while going through the start of the benchmark. This is the most intensive part. Keep in mind, we aren't actually running with all those settings either. There's actually some nice effects running. Anybody for a single slot graphics card that plays Cyberpunk at nearly 60 frames per second, in fact, it is going to go up to 60 frames per second. Yeah, I know people were saying these were good, and yeah, it took a bit more tweaking than I was expecting. I was expecting a bit more of a plug and play experience, but 5 minutes of tweaking, and you're getting Cyberpunk at 60 frames per second on what is just a PCIe lane. There's not a single 6-pin here. Okay, yeah, this could be the ultimate way to transform any system. I think the Radeon Pro might be the way forward. The frame times are insane. Pretty much 55 frames per second on average, minimums of 45. The Radeon Pro, everyone. It actually is. It's pretty insane. Wow. I was a little bit disappointed at first. I just didn't think it would be able to do that. Wow. Let's carry on. Hey, usually this is just B-roll. But our score was 3007. The best score was 3007. Do I have the record? I usually just film the benchmarks as B-roll in the background, but Yeah, Steel Nomad Lite with the Radeon Pro 5100. I now have the world record. It wasn't very hard to do. We have a world record! Yay! I don't really know what that's going to account for, but that's kind of cool. Look, we're #1! These are so easy to overclock and mod. So what exactly is this Radeon Pro WX 5100? Well, its specifications are very much in line with the weird RX 470D and RX 570D cards, which were sort of cut down Polaris cards to make sure that AMD was fully beating the GTX 1050 Ti in the Asian market. And given the RX 470D was released before this, you can clearly tell where the base of this card came from. Fortunately, with good binning and some good power management, what they've essentially done is beefed it up, given it more memory, and then brought it down in power consumption, which, as we've seen, can be at the detriment of performance if you're trying to do anything more intensive with it. It is based on the rather somewhat still relevant GCN4, being Ellesmere Polaris 10 Pro GL, which is quite the mouthful to say. You do get 8GB of GDDR5 memory running through a rather decent 256-bit memory bus. Drivers are still available quarterly, but there haven't really been all too many since December of 2025. You have 1,792 cores, 112 TMUs, 32 ROPs, and decent amounts of DirectX 12 and Vulkan support. The version we've got here, I've done a very lazy BIOS mod to unlock the full 75W TDP, and we will get into what that means. The main convenient thing is here though, you don't need any power adapters. Even with a full BIOS mod, this thing will run in virtually all systems in just the PCIe slot alone, which makes it kind of the ultimate cheap upgrade. And talking about cheap, these things are still relatively going under the radar, going as cheap as £35 in auctions, or up to £55 for buy it now examples, and you'll find plenty cropping up in the middle of this too. Now, the main thing is, if you do want to get one of these cards and actually want to use it for any form of gaming, unless you're pairing this with something like a Core 2 Duo or maybe an early Core i3, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to apply a BIOS mod. Now, I've sort of shown you the basics of how to do this, but there are plenty of tutorials online, and there's probably quite a few BIOS files available for download. All you need to do is export your BIOS from the card, and then you can then load that into the Polaris BIOS tweaker, tune up the memory, which is quite easy to do. You just increase the timings with a click button, bring the memory up to around 1800 or 1850 MHz, leave the core where it is, and then you're going to want to bring the power limits up to around 73 to 75 watts. You don't want to push it too hard because you don't want it overdrawing from your PCIe lane. But what exactly does this mean for you? Well, in real terms, like we just saw, you will pretty much double your score in 3D Mark's time spy. We went from around 1700, modded drivers didn't really change things. I mean, we gained 12 points, but really with just a power limit increase in a memory tune, which is what you should be doing, it'll bring you up to around 3040 points. You can take it a step further with core tuning, but unless you're planning on undervolting and really going into the power states, you'll just become limited by the power limit. So there's not really much point doing it, but we did gain an extra 6 points doing so. In terms of progression across 3D Mark benchmarks, we see exceptional DirectX 10 support, great DirectX 11 support, really rather decent entry DirectX 12 support in Time Spy and Steel Nomad, and actually not the worst score in the world for the full-fat Steel Nomad, which is quite reminiscent of some of those harder-to-run titles. In terms of comparisons against other cards, it doesn't look too great on the graph. I mean, it's coming in against the last workstation card we looked at, the M4000, at around 200 points less. But you do have to remember that despite being very similar specs on paper, this is a more modern architecture, and at this point is using half the power. So it's actually a pretty good showing when you keep that in mind. And you also have to factor in that in this benchmark, VRAM doesn't really tend to be too much of a limit. Where you do begin to see the limits though is in Steel Nomad, where it can quite handedly, and this is a little one-slot card, beat out cards like the RX 584GB, the GTX 970, quite easily beating out the 750 Ti, which is one of those other lower power cards, and sure, it's not coming in close to some of the other cards in this list, but for something that's cheap and uses so little power to be able to match an R9 Fury Nano in these benchmarks, that's pretty good going. Now, I'm not saying this is going completely under the radar, as some people will have heard about these Radeon Workstation cards because there's low-profile versions, there's ones going under other names, and they are all in and around this level of performance. But by applying the simple modifications we've done today, I now hold the world record in 3D Mark Steel Nomad Lite and the full-fat Steel Nomad. because all I did was apply a simple BIOS mod. That means this is one of the best examples out there, and you could get the performance today that we're showing with those simple tweaks. Genuinely, it doesn't take long to do. So far this graphics card, I have been impressed in the little testing that I have done before this, but how is it actually going to perform? Because this thing can go in any system, uses hardly any power, and seemingly has up-to-date drivers on a modern enough architecture to support most games. So could this really be one of the best budget graphics cards on the market, purely from a plug-and-play perspective? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that is with the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which really should run well on a card like this. It uses DirectX 12 and Polaris, deals with DirectX 12 and Vulkan really rather well, often seeing better performance than older APIs. And with high and very high settings in 1080p, we returned 72 frames per second on average, with really rather smooth frame times involving 1% lows down to just 66 frames per second. It's also a good time to mention that this card does have full native support for FreeSync, so provided you're using pretty much any monitor from the last 6 years, you'll get a very smooth experience on screen. If you move over into World of GTA Online, we saw that our average did get dented slightly down to 67 frames per second, with 1% lows now being in and around 59 FPS. It's worth noting that GTA Online was certainly liable to more fluctuations. It had higher highs but also lower lows, but a lot of the time when you were in smaller lobbies, you would actually see an average higher than that of single player because it is less demanding. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition is fine in single player or offline. Chances are, though, if you're looking at a graphics card like this, you might be playing with people that are also using lower-end systems and may be limited to the older GTA 5 legacy version, in which case you can sort of flex on them a little bit because you can run it with very high settings and AMD CHS shadows in 1080p and return near on 60 frames per second, with averages of 55 FPS and 1% lows down to 49 frames per second. Now, we always sort of knew this would perform slightly worse than the Enhanced Edition given it uses DirectX 11, but we do have the game nearly maxed out here in 1080p, and it is dealing with it really rather nicely. But the thing is, single player on this game isn't really where the challenge is. It's GTA Online Legacy, which doesn't run particularly well on certain cards and can certainly have frame pacing issues and other problems. See, utilization on the card did drop down, but our average didn't really change. We still saw 55 frames per second on average. However, our 1% lows, as you can tell by the frame time graph in the top left, did suffer, with 1% lows now down to 41 frames per second. You could solve this with maybe lower settings and a frame rate cap at 60 FPS, but really it's just one of those ones where you're going to have to tweak it around to get a solid frame rate, or just move to the Enhanced Edition. Or of course, just play in smaller lobbies. When you're under 16 players, this actually disappears. So we've already seen Cyberpunk with its stock settings and also the BIOS mod be able to get through the built-in benchmark at either 30 FPS or nearly 60 FPS. But how can we actually run the game when we're looking to play it? Because the benchmark is quite easy to run and not always reminiscent of real gameplay. Well, we were able to move the game up to medium settings all round with high textures enabled in a 1080p resolution using FSR3 set to balance mode. FSR3 here has a really good implementation, and I don't mind how it looks whatsoever. Either way, we returned 46 frames per second on average and 1% lows down to 41, and it's worth noting that I do take my benchmark figures during heavy combat and action, because that is where Cyberpunk is really at its most intensive. When you weren't in heavy action, it'd be anywhere from 50 to 70 frames per second in its lighter instances, but generally what you're looking at is a solid 40 to 50 FPS experience on a card like this. You've got the FreeSync. I mean, you could lower settings, but it doesn't help as much as you'd think, because you've got that VRAM pool, you might as well use it. So yeah, Cyberpunk 2077 runs fine on this little WX5100, and my big takeaway here was, you can slot this card into any system and play Cyberpunk with these visuals. Moving on into the modern world of Unreal Engine 5 bloat, and Oblivion Remastered was a bit of a weird one. We already know it's a bit of a weird one, but given the power and the architecture of this card, it does actually have a degree of optimizations in this title, where we had to move to medium and high textures just to be able to get the game smooth, because otherwise it would fluctuate too much. We had to put some more load on the card. We did have to use FSR because without it enabled, the frame rate just falls apart. Even using native resolutions just performs worse than using FSR in 1080p. Makes no sense, but that is Oblivion Remastered for you. Once the stutters had disappeared, which did take a bit longer than I was expecting, we returned 36 frames per second on average, and 1% lows down to 28. Really, what I'd recommend you to do here is probably do a bit more tweaking of the settings, cap it to 30 FPS, but hey, Oblivion Remastered running on a single slot graphics card. Usually we struggle to get this running at all, or we're limited to a 720p resolution, but not here because it has at least a modern architecture and plenty of VRAM. For some reason, if a card manages to make it through Oblivion Remastered, I feel the need to bring out the big guns. The big guns, of course, being Samson, which is pretty much one of the worst optimized titles I've ran in recent years. I enjoyed playing it, but it was a 30 FPS experience for me on an RTX 3070 laptop. So how does it fare on a cheap single-slot card? Well, miraculously, it was actually playable. Low settings and medium textures in 900p with FSR enabled returned us 34 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 25. Now, usually when I'm testing this, it's in the city that is the most intensive. That's where you see it drop down to 15 to 20 FPS. But not here. No, that runs fine. What it really struggles with for some reason was the shadows going across bridges. That will bring you down to around the 25 FPS range. When you weren't doing that, it will run between 30 to 40 frames per second. Yes, it looks absolutely hideous. The FSR implementation here is awful, similar to Oblivion, but it is playable, which is pretty good going for an unoptimized modern title. Now, this is one I was really curious to test because BeamNG, especially in the latest V0.39 update, has certainly got people talking about performance, and given it has some nice visual effects, I did want to try and keep things on at least medium or higher. Unfortunately, high settings was completely out of the question, but medium settings, which does include a few high options in there, was able to run in 900p. Now you have to keep in mind this benchmark is done in the jungle with traffic enabled, which of course does make this a lot more intensive. Fortunately, we do have the VRAM to deal with it, but even with these fancy visuals, thanks to the new implementation of DirectX 12, which does boost performance on these GCN cards, we returned 34 frames per second on average, and 1% lows down to 27 FPS. Now it's worth noting, older versions of the game will run better than this, and you will need that resolution drop down to 900p to keep you in and around that 30 FPS range if you want these visual settings turned on. Of course, simpler maps and scenarios will run better than this. This is really a worst case scenario for the card. It's paired with a good processor that's going to be, of course, allowing the game to have more vehicles enabled. But yeah, I mean, BeamNG version 0.39 does look spectacular. And you know what? I kind of like the visuals that this card is able to churn out. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a game that I enjoy configuring around, but generally it has a rough idea of how it wants to run. And surprisingly, on a WX5100, it actually picked a pretty good load of settings. It was a mixture of medium and high settings all round, with ultra textures enabled and a few other options also enabled on ultra. Red Dead Redemption 2 really does enjoy its ultra settings. We had all of this in a 1080p resolution, and how was performance? We saw averages of 65 frames per second and 1% lows down to 56 frames per second, and despite actually getting quite a lot of VRAM usage, we had enough there that even when you went into built-up areas and the cities and bits and pieces, you wouldn't actually see too much of a frame rate drop, something that can plague a lot of lower-end cards, especially when you're dealing with these settings but don't have enough VRAM for them. Here though, on the WX5100 with its 8GB of VRAM, we pretty much saw no frame rate loss whatsoever. I mean, maybe it would drop slightly under 60 FPS if there was loads going on, but generally Red Dead 2 runs perfectly in a 1080p resolution. Next up we have M&B Bannerlord, which of course is always a fun thing to test, especially on these cards. It's very well optimized but can certainly be more intensive than you'd think at very high settings, which is how the game defaulted itself to, and I was fully prepared to have to turn things down just to be able to get the frame rate playable. Generally though, in the built-in benchmark, which of course does scale the intensity of the battle with the settings you're using, we returned 53 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 38 during the flyover sequences, where there are lots of draw calls going on, especially given this is a DirectX 11 based title, and overall it pretty much ran perfectly fine. This battle is very reminiscent of the late game, so for a lot of the early to mid game you are talking in around a sort of 40 to 60 FPS experience, probably over 60 FPS a lot of the time unless there's sort of middling sized battles, and just to confirm this, I did load up a custom battle of a middling size, and yeah, it runs in and around 50 to 60 frames per second. So M&B Bannerlord, very optimized, no surprise there, but was able to run fine on the card.
Fortnite here being rather late into the benchmarks, as are the next couple of ones. Usually I do these earlier, but unfortunately they all had massive updates and had to be left overnight, and we were able to run the game with performance mode in DirectX 12, but the game had set our textures and our view distance to normal, so I thought I'll leave those as is in a 1080p resolution. We had a 200 FPS cap in place, not that it was really necessary because you could bring that down to 144 of much closer frame times, which is how I'd probably play the game, but with averages of 152 FPS and 1% lows down to 131 across a couple of matches, I'd say Fortnite isn't really going to be a problem. Unlike this card's Nvidia Workstation counterparts, which of course would be the M4000, at least in terms of the price range of things, we see that does struggle with DirectX 12 a little bit, not as much as you'd think, but here we actually see a boost in performance and the stability of the frame times, which is where I'm saying this card's appeal is, because Fortnite now does like to default to DirectX 12, of which this little one-slot graphics card deals with it fine. Now, there is no need to panic, I have gone through and benchmarked Counter-Strike 2, which unfortunately corrupted itself, so this one I had to re-download as well, where with competitive settings through the built-in workshop benchmark in a 1080p resolution, we returned 187 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 151 frames per second. So yeah, actually quite a competitive experience, and this is sort of reminiscent of if you're playing Mirage, Dust 2, Office, any of those older maps will get in and around likely better performance than this in a competitive scenario, and dropping the resolution down to popular 4x3 resolutions will bring that up to around the 230 FPS range, but to be fair, it does run pretty well out of the box with just a 1080p resolution. Now, taking these competitive settings and moving into a more intensive map like Cache, which really does bring a lot of these older cards to their knees. I mean, it is a lot more VRAM intensive, and of course, thanks to having 8GB of it here, yes, we did see our average take a noticeable dent down to 121 FPS, but 1% lows still remain pretty solid at 101. Keep in mind this is a Polaris AMD card. These do suffer with stutters in your first time loading into the map, which do disappear after you've actually played through the game. So if you're actively playing Counter-Strike, once you've played the first couple of rounds probably offline to get rid of those stutters, they don't come back until you uninstall your drivers or change graphics card. It's just something that is worth noting because some people get these cards and say, oh, Counter-Strike 2 stutters. No, play a couple of rounds, it will disappear and then it's gone until you change your graphics card. It's just something that I am very aware of because I'm changing graphics cards twice a week. Next up, we have an example of an Unreal Engine 5 title being very well optimized, and a big stark difference to Oblivion Remastered and Samson because FSR 3 here actually looks really rather nice, so we utilized it in a 1080p resolution with medium settings. And how did it run? Well, 54 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 46. It did take a second or so for the game to load in. We were just a sort of floating invisible blob for a little bit, but after this disappeared upon, it might have been because the game had done a massive update, about 40GB, but after we'd loaded in once and after subsequent restarts, this didn't happen again. It's just something I did want to note. Overall though, Arc Raiders, very playable, it looked great, there was no problems. You could probably increase the settings even more when it comes to textures because we did have a bit of space left over, but generally, Arc Raiders wasn't a problem. It always tends to run well, and being a DirectX 12 Unreal Engine 5 title, utilize FSR 3, and it will perform very well on these cards. PUBG is still a very popular title, and we have seen that the latest updates to the game have broken DirectX 12 on a lot of older GCN cards. Fortunately for us though, in this instance, Polaris is one of those GCN cards that isn't broken, so it seems to be GCN 3 and prior that are broken, but GCN 4 upwards seem to work absolutely fine, because DirectX 12 actually netted a smoother performance than DirectX 11 or DirectX 11.1 here. The game defaulted to medium settings across the board in a 1080p resolution, so I just left things as is, and we did return 56 frames per second on average, and 1% lows down to 45 frames per second. It's worth noting there was still the standard little bit of hitching and stuttering on your first match playing the game on the card, which would resolve itself in about 2 minutes or so. Generally, in actual gameplay, you'll be seeing around 40 to 50 FPS during real heavy action, but a lot of the time when the match pool gets smaller, you'll be seeing anywhere from sort of 50 to 70 frames per second, which is about common for PUBG. It's more intensive when there's more players. So PUBG works fine, and we finally reached the day where you get an actually enjoyable experience on a single slot AMD graphics card. Paralives is an interesting one to test. It's based on a modified version of Unity and still utilizes DirectX 11, but is a very VRAM hungry game, and it does certainly struggle on some of these AMD cards. With low and medium settings, which is low settings and medium textures because textures didn't make too much of a difference to the actual experience, in a 1080p resolution, we returned a playable 36 FPS on average, but it was an experience that took a little while to settle down, about 5 minutes before the stuttering stopped. After this, it seemed to be fine, and subsequent restarts of the game didn't have as much stuttering when you loaded in, but still, averages of 36 FPS, 1% lows down to 20. It's fine for the genre of game this is, but lowering resolutions didn't really help all too much. There is absolutely zero driver-side optimization going on, which is something that is actually quite important in certain DirectX 11 titles, and likely will never come to something like this because, let's be honest, this is a workstation graphics card from around 2017, 2016. It isn't going to get gaming optimizations because it never actually had them. So yeah, Paralives works, but it's not going to be the best experience. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? This was actually benchmark number 9 I did against the entire suite of 14, so this one's coming a bit late, but with normal settings and very high textures, which was quite easily handled by the 8GB of VRAM on board in a lovely 1080p resolution, it ran really nicely. Averages of 64 frames per second, 1% lows down to 55, and it goes to show that, yeah, you know what, this little card can produce some stunning visuals, even when it's in a game that just requires brute force for it. No, you won't be managing high settings all around, it simply doesn't have the power to do it, but what it can do is mask some of the lower quality effects with some stupidly high quality textures in a 1080p resolution and give you a 60 FPS experience, which is something it's pretty much been able to do across the board. It's not an overly powerful card, but purely based on the architecture it is and a huge VRAM pool, which once you've done a BIOS mod is actually not slow memory. It's actually a great card to use. Like, this is what it can do. It can brute force its way through textures with high VRAM amounts and has enough power to get decent effects in the background as well. So, overall gaming performance of the WX 5100. And to be fair, for what is a little low power card, thanks to actually being based on Polaris, which you forget how good this architecture was, it's not just power efficient when it's not left up to AMD's standard gaming overvolting, and with a custom BIOS on there, it's still using decent amounts of power. I have got the testing later. But in terms of the actual gaming experience, I mean, this is a single slot card that will quite comfortably run Cyberpunk 2077 with medium settings and high textures at in and around 40 frames per second, often higher than this when you're not in heavy action. I mean, it's even able to handle the world of Unreal Engine 5 bloat. Yes, Oblivion Remastered isn't particularly well optimized and needed FSR to actually do anything, but hey, it was able to get over 30 FPS without even using low settings. Samson, I mean, once again, not exactly an optimized title and is probably the worst Unreal Engine 5 title I've yet benchmarked, was at least able to eke out that similar 30 FPS experience. But when you're talking about 60 FPS gaming, GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, not a problem whatsoever. Red Dead Redemption 2, also not a problem whatsoever. I mean, even Arc Raiders and PUBG get very close to that 60 frames per second mark. And if we're talking about competitive gaming, well, Fortnite's going to run in well excess of 100 frames per second, and the same with Counter-Strike 2 even when you're on the latest maps. It's only when you start getting into games like Paralives, which has no driver-side optimizations on an older API, you begin to see the limitations of the card. But even then, for DirectX 11 gaming, it's not actually too bad, because when you look at something like M&B Bannerlord, you're still going to be maxing it out with near 60 FPS in 1080p, on a little single slot card with no extra power required. I do really quite like this style of AMD drivers that are quite common on GCN cards and Polaris cards, where you do get a lot of control, and even these workstation drivers, as we covered earlier, pretty much just seem to be reskinned gaming drivers. You get all of the same functionality. So if you wanted to go back to some of those older DirectX 9 or earlier titles, you can turn on EQAA up to 8 times, anisotropic filtering, increase the tessellation, set it to GPU scaling so you can run perfect 4x3 resolutions, and they work really really rather well. I'm not too sure what was happening in Star Wars Battlefront because some of the foliage did turn blue. This only happened on certain maps because the game actually looked amazingly crisp with all of these enhancements turned on, producing hundreds of frames per second with the highest settings, so it was a bit of a weird one to see that it struggled there. Then again, there's probably some tweaks or workarounds you could do to get around that. I went back a little bit older still and tried Morrowind, which really the graphics card was just sitting back doing nothing with, but in a 1024x768 resolution, just to try out the GPU scaling features, you got a very crisp output with really good texture filtering and anti-aliasing. So if you wanted something to use for even classic gaming, well, you wouldn't even really need to BIOS mod something like this. It has more than enough power out of the box for great retro uses at even up to 1080p resolutions. So if you were considering this for maybe some classic PC gaming, yeah, anything from the DirectX 9 or DirectX 10 era is going to run perfectly. It's only when you start getting into the later DirectX 11 titles you're going to notice some slowdown, but by that point we're already talking about modern games that people are still playing on Steam. So for your classic gaming, you've got decent drivers that allow you some decent enhancements to be enabled. But the thing is, these single-slot graphics cards usually come with some form of limitations, because it seems all too good to be true. It takes about 5 minutes to tweak it and set it up with a modified BIOS, and suddenly you're playing Cyberpunk near 60 frames per second. Surely there has to be some sort of trade-off. Well, when it comes to power consumption, it is actually really remarkably good given that this is a binned Polaris chip that is limited to what the PCIe lane can offer it. When you use it just out of the box, you're talking around 43 watts on a sustained stress test, or when you're running it with our unlocked BIOS, it uses around 73 watts, so it gains about 30 watts of headroom. Generally, when you're talking about gaming, it's in and around similar figures. Workstation use is very much geared towards the power-limited BIOS. Yes, you get some more performance out of it with the unlocked BIOS, but it does come at around 30 watts extra power usage. Idle was the same as both, because I didn't change the power states for it, but of course the part everyone will be interested in is the thermal performance. Under a full stress test, which was taken in Firmark, which is brutal on the GCN architecture, we saw peaks of 86 degrees with our unlocked BIOS, where it was around the high 70s without it. Gaming, on the other hand, was actually really rather good, with thermals being around the high 60s with its stock BIOS, or around the high 70s with the unlocked BIOS. Yes, the fan did run slightly faster, but it's not a particularly noisy unit. It's only a little fan, but it's not one that's little and annoying. It was able to get the heat out when we were using it for gaming tasks. Workstation was around where you'd expect, and idle, once again, it's a little fan. It drops down to 1000 RPM, so it does leave quite a lot of heat in the heatsink, hovering around the mid-40s. So yeah, it actually worked better than I was expecting. I was thinking thermals could be a problem, we might have to tear it apart, new thermal paste, but no, it's fine. And generally, you probably aren't going to have to change the thermal paste on these because, well, they don't get too hot for their intended purpose with their stock BIOS, which means the thermal paste shouldn't have cooked itself just yet. But here is the big appeal. I was going to do this down as an edited live segment, but it would just elongated the sake of the video for no particularly useful reason. So instead I just filmed it and I thought I'd narrate over the top. I took the PC that we built using nothing but components from CEX, and if you saw that video you'll know that we got it running with an R9 380X, running really power limited states to be able to run it on a 300 watt power supply, which was a lot of faffing around. It was rather fun to do, it was a nice challenge for the video, but in all honesty, the real solution to PC gaming is buy one of these, flash the BIOS, and just install it in a computer like that. That's running an old 1155 motherboard that we put a power-limited 3770S into, which is an Ivy Bridge Core i7. And with that upgrade made, that's a gaming computer. There isn't any need to worry about the power supply because the processor's not using very much, and this graphics card can only pull 75 watts. And that is the use for this, because it'll work in virtually all PCI Express slots, unless we're talking the ones that are limited down to 30 watts or 20 watts, in which case you're limited really to display adapters, not actual graphics cards like this. So yeah, it will work in virtually all systems, so if you want to take your Optiplex, if you want to take an old workstation and just chuck one of these into it, that is where the value is, because I'm telling you now, it does work. So there we have it, the Radeon WX 5100, And these are a little bit harder to find than the older Nvidia option that we covered a few weeks ago, purely because they are more modern and they haven't quite flooded the market to the same capacity. There are people still using these in modern workstations that haven't felt the need to upgrade. However, I could see in the coming months or possibly years, these things are going to get very cheap very fast and probably even easier to find. The reason for that? Driver updates are looking rather bleak. So, I mean, that's not really too much of a problem for gaming because these aren't particularly gaming optimized drivers in the first place. They will work for gaming, as we've just seen. But unlike the Nvidia card, which is old enough to be flooding the market, these are still being used by businesses, and they are gradually replacing them. Now they are nearing their end of life, at least in terms of the business cycle, but that's really where these are going to begin to shine. I can see these becoming quite a common option. So I'd say if you are looking for a single slot graphics card that doesn't need much power and will let you play lots of the popular titles out there, not with bad graphic settings, I mean, it's got the VRAM, it's got the driver side support, it's actually got a modern enough architecture underneath that it's going to work really well, that, yeah, I think this is a great card to go for. Yes, you will need to mod the BIOS. There are millions of tutorials out there. There are so many guides to follow, and once you've done it once with Polaris, I've already dabbled with it before, so I knew what I was doing, then, yeah, you will quickly figure out how to get the most performance out of it. So I hope you've all enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. There are still a few of these on eBay at the time of this video going live, and I've seen them crop up on workstation reseller websites for a similar price. So if you are looking for one of these, get on it fast before all the stock disappears, because after the performance I've seen today, I can't really think of any better options off the top of my head that are this readily available in this form factor and require, yeah, a little bit of tweaking, but suddenly, as you just saw, we're talking modern gaming at nearly 60 FPS, which I don't think many cards in this form factor are able to do. So thank you all very much for watching, and good night.